Welcome, Claudius. It's a great pleasure to have you with me in this conversation. I always admire your brain and your way of thinking, and this is a great opportunity for me and the people that are listening to this to get your perspective on the situation, the actual situation we're going through. Before doing that, though, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself, and then we'll go into a couple of questions that I have for you, if you don't mind.
So it's great to be with you, Davide. Claudius van Wyk, born in South Africa, born in Cape Town, been living in the United Kingdom for the last 10 years. My particular passion has been the shift from a reductionistic view of life, from looking at life from a mechanistic, materialistic perspective, to a more process-orientated, energetic view of life, organismic. And so I've kind of worked with a philosophy of holism for my whole life. And I was very delighted to be able to come across complexity theory, which really looks at complex adaptive systems, and couple that to my training in neuro-linguistic programming that really looks at how we frame our experience of the world by the language we use. How we actually can trap ourselves epistemologically in the words we use into a particular world perspective. And so I've been able to synthesize the training of neuro-linguistic programming, how we perceive the world, into the shift from a reductionistic, mechanistic to a holistic, organismic perspective. And that is my passion, to help people to open their eyes to that possibility, because I believe we all have that intrinsically, but we've been schooled and trained in a particular way to see the world. And it is that way of seeing the world that has probably generated most of the problems we are experiencing in the world. So that's my passion, Davide.
That's beautiful. And you know what, you know me, I love language and I love complex systems. So, you know, you're right into my alley in some ways, and I love to hear your perspective. And mainly in this moment, what we're going through right now, which mechanistic mindsets, you know, don't really work well in a time of uncertainty, in a time of change, in a time of radical shift that the world is going through. I believe to go from mechanistic to complex systems and to complexity, that will, I believe, give us a way to approach what's coming, which we don't know what's going to look like. This is actually one of the most fearful and exciting things for me, because we don't know what's going to happen in 2 months, in a year, and the time to come. Yet to take it holistically, to embrace everything rather than just trying to do what you've always done, to be able to go to make it through, I think is hopeful. There's a lot of hope in that. So could you please go a little more in depth into this point of view, and just so we can understand a little better and maybe grasp even ways to begin to go in that direction, rather than try to hold on to something that, as you say, probably has been the cause of many of our problems today.
Yes. So, Davide, I think a very good place to start is to look at this COVID-19 crisis. Because what we are faced with here is one of those very peculiar situations of an unseen enemy. We're faced with a situation where the most fearful thing is the unknown. When we can see the enemy in front of us, we know what the enemy is, but when we can't see it, then it's even more fearful. And so it really points to the problem with that materialistic perspective. It really points to the fact that we're saying, if we can identify it under a microscope, then we have seen the enemy. And if we can identify what the enemy is made up of, then we can find ways of materialistically destroying the enemy. So until now, the entire approach to the COVID crisis, to the pandemic, has been a materialistic focus. We need to identify the agent and we need to identify the antidote. So there's great rush to find a vaccine, and in the meanwhile to prevent the spread of the disease. And that's understandable and that's correct. But I think what we have missed is that the whole of life is a set of very complex and subtle interactions in which the very microbial world not only lives around us, but lives within inside us. And by trying to reduce the world to hard borderlines into that mechanistic perspective of this is it and this is it not, we've actually eliminated those subtleties that actually are the life-giving subtleties. I was astonished many years back to discover that there are colonies of microbes that live in our very eyelashes. And those microbes, they feed off all of the sebaceous fluid, and they feed off the particles that the eyelashes sweep out of the atmosphere. But at the same time, those microbes help to move the sebaceous fluid down the eyelashes, and so keep the eyelashes supple and smooth. That process, when you look at it right into the very foundations of life, looks at synergies, things that work together and complement each other's factors. It's called mutuality. Looks at symbiosis, where things enable living systems together. Looks at endosymbiosis, where we actually internalize that into greater holistic organs until eventually that builds up to who we are. So just to give you a simple example of that, the very mitochondria that live in our cells, that are responsible for the release of energy and the management of energy in our living cells. At one point, they used to be free-floating living organisms in the oceans, but we took them in. So all of life has been an emergence of greater and greater complex relationships. And in our mechanistic world, we are focused on hard lines, hard borders, and we've eliminated those subtleties from our thinking. We've in fact called it non-scientific. We've created a worldview in which we can mechanistically control all of these factors, and that worldview is still largely informing our view towards the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I just want to bring this to close this loop. If we then look at the hundreds of thousands of people who've already recovered from having the COVID infection, there's no vaccine. Some of them were kept alive by ventilators, but really what did the job was their own immune systems. It was the quality of their immune response that was able to identify the COVID virus and neutralize it, particularly the NK cells, the natural killer cells. And so that capacity of self-organization, that capacity of the human adaptive system to be able to deal with its environment has been compromised by two particular challenges. One challenge is that we have sanitized our world to such an extent that the immune system doesn't get a chance to learn how to cope with it. As children, we used to play in the dirt. Now we desanitize everything. And the other thing that compromised it is because we are so reliant on the systems and materialistic approaches to deal with these things, we now have the great fear of the unknown. We have the fear of a virus, and that very fear itself compromises the immune system in a study that is called psychoneuroimmunology. So we're caught in a trap. Elvis Presley sings a song, we're caught in a trap. We're caught in a trap which is a perceptual trap, where we become blinkered by the mechanistic view and we've lost the subtle holistic view. And that, I believe, is the area that is creating an opportunity for us to reconsider how to engage with this COVID crisis and optimize the embedded opportunities, Davide.
Now, let me get this clear, because I like the way you explain this thing, because in one way we tried to protect ourselves from the outside, and that made our system, self-protective system, go down. Basically, our immune system didn't have to do the job that it used to have to do. And on the other side, the fear of the unknown is actually dropping also the capacity we have for our immune system to be able to react or respond in a productive way to the situation. So we're actually damaging ourselves with what we've done. And obviously, you know, these two elements are quite strong at this point in time. But if you would say to somebody, okay, now let's recover some of our power back, you know, how would you say that would be? could be done? At least how can we start to recover, you know, the fact that we are part of the complex system and we are part of the solution only if we let ourselves be part of it. I know that sounds kind of strange, but that's really what I'm getting out of this conversation.
No, you're right on target there in my book. You're right on target. So I want to share with you a process of thinking. What we've tried to do is to say we could look at very complicated theories, very complex theories, deep philosophy. And for many ordinary people that haven't had the opportunity to do that study, it would just be complex language. So what we've done is we've reduced our approach to 7 steps. And I'm going to briefly just describe those to you. And you can interrupt at any point. So the first step is to identify any challenge as a problem space. A problem space is some issue that needs to be addressed. It might be our personal finances, it might be our mood. It might be a situation like the threat of a disease. We define that as a problem space. And the very first thing we want to do with a problem space is we want to identify the sensory inputs that we're responding to. So we could say the world economy is a mess. That is not a helpful statement. But if we can say, what are you seeing with your own eyes? What are you hearing people talking about with your own ears? What are you feeling happening around you? If we can get to the sensory specifics, now the problem space becomes real. So that's the first step, is to get to the sensory specifics of the problem space insofar as it affects us directly, insofar as we are in that space, so we know there's something we can do about that, other than theorize and speculate and be afraid, as you've emphasized. The second step then is to identify what is the meta outcome. If I'm going to be addressing this problem space, what is the greater outcome that I'm wanting to achieve by successfully addressing it? So we might say, in the case of the COVID crisis, we simply want to go back to normal. We just want to get things back to where they were. But there's a whole lot of people that's saying, you know what, we're not going back to normal, nor do we want to go back to normal, because normal was taking us to a problem space anyway. Maybe we want to get to a much better place of dealing with this situation, of drawing the lessons from this situation. So identifying the meta outcome then gives us the motivation to engage with the problem space. Now the next space that we go to is we must identify, is it a complicated problem space or is it a complex problem space? And there are 2 differentiators in that. In a complicated problem space, an expert will be able to analyze it. They would be able to find all the operative agents and components, and they'd be able to come up with a best practice or good practice solution. So any complicated thing like a mobile phone or aircraft, some expert will know how to fix it. But when you come to a complex problem space, like a pandemic, there's no best practice. There's no expert that can actually say, this is the way to fix it. Because there are so many unknown factors. There are so many relationships of which we are unaware, that invisible world of which we are so afraid. And so what we need to do there is twofold. The first thing we need to do is we need to change our shift from being able to identify a particular agent or a broken part, and we need to observe and look at the tendencies and look at the processes. We need to see where things are going. And in the seeing where they're going, we can try to identify patterns, which is why your artificial intelligence now and mass data production is really starting to track trends and patterns, because if we can see a pattern, we can eventually see a structure. And then you can say, let us probe with different kinds of responses. Let's test this, let's test that. So in the case of Germany, for example, they've now eased some of those lockdown regulations, and they're going to be watching what the spread of infection rate looks like. They'll be testing the response. Similarly in Italy, similarly in Spain. That's so necessary. But you need to test in a way, and this is so difficult when we look at a pandemic, we need to look at a test in a way that is safe to fail. If you do a test, you want to make sure that you don't have a potential disaster on your hands. So it wants subtlety and it wants immediate capacity to respond. We suggest you can't have rigid policies. You've got to have a space for leadership, for flexibility, for experimentation. And so that differentiation between a complicated problem space and a complex problem space is really, the complex problem space is demanding those new lenses that we've been talking about. So that's the third step. Is it complex or is it complicated? Because if it's complicated, apply best practice. If it's complex, observe trends, test, respond, adapt. I'm just going to stop for a minute because you might want to inquire into that.
There is a lot you've said already, and to me it's very powerful. You know that the distinction here. You know, first of all, you went from a general assessment of the situation, which in turn generates more fear, to a more specific addressing of my own perception of what's going on and what's around me, which I believe it really grounds everything into the present. And then when you moved on into this complicated and complex, I really like the distinction that you do there, because I believe we are used to complicated things, so we want experts to tell us what to do, and that's really what sometimes even for me has been quite of a problem, because complex is different, because complex is a series of observations and taking in consideration the whole picture. And now obviously we're not going to be able as a person to lead this type of observation, because every nation is doing it at a macro level, and so basically we're all just waiting for their solutions to be applied, and we hope they're not going to make a huge mess out of their experimentation. But that's a little farther than what a normal person you may say could really apply for himself. I like the beginning, like reduce the problem to what's your experience of it, and I think that's something I can handle. Move from complicated to complex. I like that as a mindset for everybody. I would love for everybody to do that, but I think it's really, now this is happening at a macro level, and what I would like to leave with people, even after this conversation, is something they can switch off the video and start to do for themselves. So how can that be a personal approach rather than a macro approach? Because I know the whole world is trying to approach this, and so I feel like very small in the context of everybody trying to solve this huge pandemic that it's everywhere in the world, and everybody's doing it differently, and so you get confused, and maybe you look at somebody else maybe have better results and you don't. Like for instance, in Italy we have something in Mantova. There's a doctor that found this hyperimmune plasma, which is basically they take the blood out of the people that have been coming back from the COVID-19, and then they inject the plasma. They divide the blood and then inject the plasma into the people that have the disease, and they get better. Actually, it's a full month, nobody dies in Mantova at this point in time. So there is something that is actually going on in specific places, but it doesn't seem like the whole world is paying attention too much to these little things. So it feels like frustrating to see that somebody's doing it better, somebody doesn't care, and you look and you're like an observer, from the outside. But again, what I like to leave people with is something they can do with themselves in the process also. So if you could, just direct our conversation into that, I would totally appreciate it.
Yes, well, absolutely. So you were preempting and you were anticipating the next step. And the next step number 4, is what is the personal contribution to that problem space? It is to ask the people, in what sort of way am I contributing to that problem space? So let me, for example, just come back to what you were talking about, that most people can deal with complicated, but complex makes almost too difficult to deal with. Fact is that the most complex situation is human relationships. And you and I are dealing with human relationships every day. Even in this conversation, we're working with complexity. There is your perspective, there is my perspective, there is how we're interpreting the communication that's happening, there's the attitude towards the listener, what would they be gaining from this? There's the attitude of what information really am I able to provide that will be useful? And we are finding our way in sense making. So our sense making as individuals is a large part of that problem space. Now, if we have a person whose attitude is generally one that is excited about life and curious about life, there's one form of sense making. But if the attitude is informed by a negative emotion, and I use the negative emotion in respect of it is either anger-driven, frustration, fear-driven, anxiety, loss-driven, disappointment, or aversion-driven, it runs counter to my values. Those negative, if we're approaching the problem space through the lenses of an emotional experience, then we will find the evidence that we're looking for to validate our emotional experience. If we're looking with curious eyes, if we're looking with eyes of deep interest, then we will be able to find the processes. And so the lesson that we can learn in terms of how to deal with complexity is to say, what am I focusing on? In this conversation, I might be wondering if you're going to be asking me a trick question to make me look less intelligent than I'd like to look. Or I might be saying, I wonder where we can go with this conversation. It is that attitude of what I'm focusing on that is going to largely determine the outcome of the very process that we're engaged in. And so my invitation to folks when dealing with the COVID crisis is, rather than to focus on what they're afraid about, to become curious about their own responses, to what extent they have the opportunity to self-empowerment, to manage to self-regulate their own moods, to what extent their relationship and their dialogue and their conversations with their colleagues and friends and families are empowering, are engaging, are uplifting, or are actually helping them to go in that downward spiral of frustration, anger, fear, anxiety. It is that self-reflection that says, is my attitude having a bearing on the problem space, that often identifies the what we can do about it, identifies the space for a more proactive intervention. So I'm going to stop there a moment because I think you might want to just explore that as well.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I love greatly is to substitute fear with curiosity. That's really something I really love. And what you're saying about what am I entertaining with my relationships around me? Am I entertaining and so feeding my fear and my concern, or am I exploring my emotions, and how can that be? I mean, I think that's the core. The core of the shift, because if I transform my fear into curiosity, I then enter into a wonderment state, which is totally productive, instead of being the fear and then alimenting my concern about the future and about what's going to happen to me. So that really, to me, gives a lot of room for people. What are we entertaining? I mean, most of our day, is it entertained by looking on the social media, or looking at the are they trying to do something to us? Because there's a lot of that around. There's a lot of people that are concentrated on, oh, what's going to happen to me? They're doing some games here, and I'm just somebody that will have to deal with the effects of it. So when I enter in that state, I feel powerless and concerned and fearful, But if I enter in the wonderment, not of the same things, but how can I use this? How can we emotionally engage such that this breakdown can bring life to us? I mean, that's in a nutshell, that is really what I wish for people to shift from into, because I think that really changes the whole game. Because from fear to wonderment, then I enter in a space that there's no limit to the beauty that can come out of the darkness or the worst pandemic or the worst disaster. That's a beautiful thing.
Yes. So absolutely. So if your listeners forget everything we've had this conversation about, Davide, I would like them to just remember 4 things. And the first is that that state of coherent, curious mindset that is most empowering of the immune response rests on 4 qualities of experience. And the first quality of experience is appreciation. The first quality of experience is the capacity to, in all situations, to identify what is good. If anybody taught us how to do that, it was Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, who was able to notice the sunrise and the sunset and say, life is doing what it must do. Who was noticed the new blades of grass coming out in spring through the bricks, saying life is doing, looking for the good and true, which reminded him of the abiding principles of life. So the first quality is appreciation, the appreciation for companionship, the appreciation for having a plate of food on the table. Once we've developed a culture of appreciation, it then immediately projects into positive expectation. That's the second lesson. There is a better opportunity that's possible coming out of this. Once again, Viktor Frankl stressed that with his fellow inmates in Auschwitz. He said, hold the dream of your future. Hold the dream of being reunited with your loved ones. And he found that those people that could hold the dream survived, and those who gave up didn't. And so that's the second aspect, is positive expectations, holding the dream of possibility, which emphasizes the curiosity of what are the potentials that are emerging. The third aspect is the sense of self-confidence. It is the sense of celebrating the fact that we've come this far as individuals, as a human race, our adaptiveness, our ingenuity, our creativeness. It is celebrating who we are and getting a self-confidence in this robustness of the human species as an aspect of robust life. And that sense then reinforces the awe. And then finally, and probably the most critical element of those 4, is the quality of our relationships. When we have come to that sense of appreciation, when we've come to those positive expectations, the sense of self-confidence, we realize that it's always in a state of relationality that happens. The greater the project, the more people are involved. And so that is the essential holistic principle. We're in this together, and we can achieve so much more together. So if listeners were to forget everything else we've spoken about and all the technical language we've used, if we can remember those 4 principles, we'll have a great takeaway.
Now, I mean, this is a very dense. We had a very dense conversation, and I really care for it, and I love, you know, if anybody wants to ask questions, we might do another one. You know, if this generates interest, we might come back on it, because there's a lot, and I believe you touched on some of the most pivotal things that we can do in this process to be able to not only survive, but actually take the best out of what's happening and get into this new world that we don't even know what's going to look like. So for now, I really thank you, Claudius, for your contribution, and I hope we can carry on this conversation in a future, and we can do another conversation like this for the people that are listening. So thank you very much for your contribution.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.